Hello, my friends. How are you? Welcome to another episode of 30 Albums for 30 Years, 1964 through 1994. I am your host, Jay Sweet. Today we are continuing our evaluation of records released in 1965. Today's record's a great one. It's a jazz album, Herbie Hancock's Maiden Voyage, recorded March 17th of 1965 and released sometime during that year. I don't have an exact date. Joining me for today's show is Mike Kaplan, who you might remember from season number 1. He's returning as a guest, and it's always great to talk to Mike about jazz. Mike is a great saxophone player, arranger, composer. I think he was a jazz DJ for some time. Very knowledgeable about the music, and it's always great to talk to Mike Kaplan. But before I do so, I want to give you some background on this record, Maiden Voyage from Blue Note Records. It's Herbie Hancock's 5th studio release and his most celebrated album to this point. It's somewhat less experimental than his previous release, Empyrean Isles. Maiden Voyage was meant to be a concept album, an instrumental reflection of oceanic life. The band is made up of legends: George Coleman on tenor sax. We interviewed George Coleman's Jr., George Coleman's son, for the program. Freddie Hubbard on trumpet. Ron Carter, who was a guest on this program as well, on bass. Tony Williams on drums, and of course the great Herbie Hancock on piano. Now, at the time of the recording, Carter, Hancock, and Williams were part of Miles Davis's group, and Coleman had worked with that band during periods in 1964 and 1965. So essentially, it's Miles Davis's group with a replacement trumpet player, that being Freddie Hubbard. Now, according to the 1999 liner notes for a reissue of the record, Bob Blumenthal, who wrote those liner notes, revealed that there was an attempt made to record the album 3 days earlier with Freddie Hubbard playing cornet and not trumpet, and Stu Martin playing drums and not Tony Williams. Now, those tracks were apparently rejected and have since been lost, which is a shame. The record, Maiden Voyage, includes 5 Herbie Hancock tracks, 2 of which are amongst his most beloved songs, and they bookmark the album. The first is Maiden Voyage, and the album concludes with Dolphin Dance. So it's a good one. I hope you enjoy today's episode, Maiden Voyage by Herbie Hancock. All right, Mike, how are you doing, man?
I am doing great. It's a pleasure to be back with you, Jay. I've been looking forward to this.
Good. Yeah, welcome back. I think this is the first time I've had a repeat guest on the show.
Wow, what an honor.
or maybe I've run out of people who want to talk to me. I don't know.
I like the first assessment better.
No, I of course invited you back because I wanted you back. You did such a great job with the first one that we did.
Thank you very much. Hopefully, people are recovered from that one. I know that was a marathon.
No, you know what? It's one of the higher rated ones that I've done. So apparently,
Nice.
Apparently we did something right, But today we're going to talk a Maiden Voyage, Herbie Hancock.
Yeah, what a fantastic album.
Yes, I agree. It certainly is. So, I mean, I'm going to keep it a little more general this time. Just tell me, your overall thoughts on the record.
Well, first of all, it's a record I've had since high school, and no matter how many times I listen to it, it's always the right time. I never get tired of this record. It just had so many great elements going for it, and before I could really even analyze it, the music touched me. So,
yeah, were you playing at this time when you first heard it, or just getting into jazz?
Well, I was trying to play jazz at that time. I don't know if I was playing jazz.
But your interest was in jazz.
Oh yeah, I was learning bebop heads. Not really improvising well on them, but
right. So your first, thinking back, what prompted you even to? If you can even think this far back, what prompted you even to pick up this record?
Well, the jazz radio at the time played this record, and especially the title track.
Right.
So first there was, I'm trying to remember what the station was in the late 60s when I started listening. And then RVR, WRVR in New York played the record a lot. All the DJs liked the record.
Excellent.
And
Cool.
it wasn't new at that time. It's just such a classic record and such a perennial, you know.
It is. It's. I mean, I would think it's got to be one of the staples of somebody's, collection. If especially if they were collecting jazz records.
So it should be.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. So I mean, just overall, I mean, what is it about? Like now that you've been through it now, and I mean, you can seriously analyze the record. What I mean, what is it about this album that makes it so special? Do you think?
Well, it's a combination of really great and varied compositions and great improvising. For me, it's what a you were asking what makes a great jazz record.
Yeah.
Th- This this is one combination that makes for a great jazz record. I think that's a very broad question because what makes a great Louis Armstrong record or a great Miles Davis or a great Duke Ellington or a Coltrane, it's all different, you know. Um, but most great jazz albums should have great improvising, creative improvising, surprising, hopefully. Although there are some fantastic albums that um, don't necessarily have surprising improvising.
Right. So when you say surprising improvising, I mean, and I should have patterned that question a little differently. I think you're absolutely right in your assessment of like jazz is a very broad term and it's a very broad question. And what makes a great maybe big band album as opposed to a great small group album from the 1960s might be two very different things, right?
Yeah,
But when you say I think you use the word surprises, right? Is it more like when you say surprising, is it more taking risks?
in this case, they take risks, but they're well. Let me back up a little bit.
Hmm.
Um, they are they are coming up with something new, but it's not breaking. It's not exactly breaking the mold. It's not revolutionary.
Right.
It's not something like the last record we analyzed, Out to Lunch.
Right, Eric Dolphy, right.
Yeah. Um, Everything they're doing is musical and in service of the music. Not to say that Dolphy's record isn't musical either.
Right. Obviously, you like that one. So,
I love that record.
of course,
Uh,
as mhm.
but it's less it's something special. It's something new, but it's not so, hitting you in the face type new. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think it makes total sense. Even when you listen back to Herbie's previous record, which we analyzed in year one, 1964, Empyrean Isles, which is that record, I guess, for lack of a better term, is almost a little bit more out, if you will, where I think there's elements of that, but I think in a sense, I use this analogy, the term Maiden Voyage it's meant the songs are meant to have some kind of a centralized theme, like an ocean journey or something dealing with oceanic life. But it could be a maiden voyage. If I'm going to tell a listener to listen to a Herbie Hancock album, this might be the one I give them first as their maiden voyage into this music and into possibly even what was going on in jazz around this time and around
Yeah, acoustic jazz from this time. Well, there wasn't electric jazz at this point,
not quite yet, right? But it's coming soon.
but yeah, small group jazz. This is a great entree.
Right, because it's accessible enough where I think a casual listener can appreciate it, especially the two tunes that are the ones most people might in the jazz realm would know, which is Maiden Voyage and Dolphin Dance, and
Right.
maybe Eye of a Hurricane to a lesser extent. But the individual soloists are they're taking risks, I think for sure.
Yes. So one great thing is they are you can tell that they are not playing planned stuff or wrote stuff. They are taking chances, but they're doing it real musically.
Yes. Right. So,
So,
I mean, no, go ahead. Continue. I'm sorry.
so here's the way I feel. You have four of the five musicians on the album are cutting edge improvisers of that time who I think each of them had a profound influence on players that came afterwards. So I'm talking about Hancock, of course,
Mhm.
Ron Carter, Tony Williams, and Freddie Hubbard. Each had a major influence. And the fifth player, um, he's a just a really was and is a really fine musical and creative improviser. That's George Coleman.
Right.
And interesting. I'm not sure if we want to get this far in, but um, it's interesting that he was chosen for this record and not Wayne Shorter. And I think Hancock had a certain sound he wanted for this record. He wanted sort of a little bit more rounded sound. Wayne Shorter can sometimes sound a bit edgy. And don't get me wrong, I would have loved to have heard what Wayne Shorter would have done with these compositions. But overall, I feel that Coleman was the right choice for this record.
Now, was Coleman, forgive me if I'm wrong, but Coleman was working with Miles's group.
So I looked that up.
Right. The timeline is a little shaky for me on that.
All right. So that I wanted to check that out. And actually, Wayne Shorter had come into Miles Davis's group in September of '64, according to what I could Google. And this record was recorded, I think, May of '65.
March of, I think maybe March of '65. It could be May. Okay.
Nevertheless, Coleman was already out of Miles's group, so one might think that Hancock would have tapped Wayne Shorter for this record, but I think he had a certain sound, and Coleman fit it. George Coleman fit it.
Right, but they had obviously worked together previously with Miles.
Yes, yeah.
So it's not like, and I guess maybe timeline wise, I guess it's almost about the same amount of time that he knew Wayne or played with Wayne Shorter as much as he's played with Coleman in Miles's group.
Yes.
And I'm not sure. Are you aware that there was an attempt that was made without even Tony Williams for this record?
Oh, really? Wow. I hadn't
Yeah.
heard that. Who was originally on that?
A guy by the name of Stu Martin.
Wow.
Stu Martin, who had played with a lot of people, but he's not somebody you would think of as, and then as being with, as the first choice. And actually, they also recorded with Freddie was playing cornet instead of trumpet for the original.
Was Freddie on cornet on the Empyrean Isles album?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, he did play cornet. So, but they rejected those takes, and they don't exist anymore.
Well, that's a shame, but nevertheless, I think this was the right move to have Tony Williams on there.
Yeah, but that's according to Bob Blumenthal. I think they did in his liner notes, I want to say 1999 when they reissued the album. But just to think But yeah, an interesting choice. And Coleman to me is an interesting figure, and I think you're probably the perfect guy to discuss it with because you even made a distinction between him and the other four musicians, and I think many people would. What is why why does he not fit into that category, do you think? Everyone says they agree he's a fine player, and he is a fine player, and I actually really love his playing on this record. And
I do too. I think Hancock made the absolute right choice
Mhm.
there.
But why is he not considered? Like I always think of him as maybe not being in the upper echelon of people who've inspired other saxophone players, perhaps. But he was in that mix of the first tier saxophone players, and of course Miles. Whether he released them or Coleman went on his own way on his own accord. I'm not entirely. I've heard both.
Uh,
Both you said, but
I mean, I had heard that Tony Williams. I could be wrong.
Mhm.
Tony Williams wanted Wayne Shorter in there, and Miles had his eyes on Wayne Shorter for many years.
Right, right, and of course with Wayne Shorter, you get a great composer. Coleman did write some music, and he wrote some very good music. But Wayne Shorter is one of the premier jazz small group composers, of the latter half of the 20th century.
No doubt about it.
Yeah. So I mean, from a saxophonist standpoint, George Coleman, why was he? What about his? Why is it he's not in that same conversation as say sometimes like a Joe Henderson or maybe even a Coltrane was or something like this?
I he certainly had a recognizable sound and style, but um, it didn't really move things forward. It wasn't that different. I'm not trying to demean him. I,
No, I agree. I'm actually in agreement with you. Uh, but it's an interesting. He is on some great great albums and
Absolutely, yeah. I love his playing,
right.
but there are some people that sort of change the language. So Hubbard changed the language.
Okay.
I mean, he wasn't revolutionary, but yet he to me he came up with new ways of saying things that were quite influential. And Hancock, Carter, and Williams, uh, all same category.
Yeah, and I think when you talk about Hancock, Carter, and Williams,
Yeah,
they yes, individually they did, but collectively what they were doing as a rhythm section was incredible, and that definitely changed the direction of jazz. What a rhythm section might be capable, or what might even be acceptable from a rhythm section. Working with Miles's band, and of course they were very young, all of them really.
but it seemed from the very beginning they sort of had this because you can hear even on the first live recordings that they had some sort of ESP. They
Yeah,
were totally hooked in with each other, and you could also tell that they were not content to stay where people had been. They wanted to move it forward. They wanted to do it creatively, but but musically at the same time. And they just continued to grow and surprise, through all the years that they were in that Miles quintet.
yeah. There's some kind of connectivity between the three of them that's like uncanny, right? And their willingness to take risks, even while playing with an established guy like a Miles Davis, to have
Right.
like really just the balls to do to do what
I,
they were doing. Um,
I
wa-
think the balls might have come from Tony, actually. I
I,
mean, they were all like that, but seems like Tony Williams might have been the one that really prodded it forward, you know.
Yeah, it seems to be, especially when you listen to, they had record I think Tony's first recordings may have been with Miles. I could be wrong.
Mhm.
Herbie certainly had done some stuff before, although again, young musician at the time. Ron did as well. But yes, when you put Tony Williams in the mix, as opposed to maybe a Stu Martin,
I I would have I'd love to hear that, but I guess it's gone.
it's a guy. And no disrespect to Stu Martin, who I'm really not all that familiar with, to be quite honest. But yeah, there's this connectivity, and then so that's where I've been thinking about my own question about what makes a great jazz album. And I wonder if I think you've touched on some of the things, but I think there has to be this overall conversational element that
Yes.
um in this case, and some of my favorite jazz albums and some of the ones we reviewed, there's sort of like a centralized concept as well. This being, I mean, I think it's a little bit overdone. It's a little bit lost, except for the song titles, but it has, supposed to have this oceanic theme. But there's a sound element that's created between these individuals,
I
and
I I can hear the oceanic element in spots. Um, but I don't. I feel it's like it's an abstract what in
mm,
an abstract way. Like when I first picked up this record, yeah, I read the liner notes, but
right,
I I wasn't thinking about that at all. I was just hearing the music. But
right,
I I can hear at times sort of that nautical theme. There's a certain lilt, you know,
yeah,
in the title track, for example, Maiden Voyage. I could sort of feel the waves. It's sort of gentle and then occasionally a little bit more agitated.
yeah,
Um, it's reflected in some of the sections in the solos too. But that figure that they do feels to me like it could be like the waves in the ocean.
yeah. I agree. And but I think a lot of it is in. So one of the biggest challenges I have, and I wonder you might even experience this, because we mainly write instrumental music. The title, because it's the only impression that the listener really will get without the musical element, right? Because there's no lyrics.
Right.
So you title something and then instantaneously, like if I title the piece, sunset, it's going to give you automatically a programmed image in your mind. And I think, the titles had a good deal to do with it. But once you know that, it does kind of create a concept. For example, like Eye of the Hurricane, you could hear the angst in some of that music. Like,
Right. The agitation there.
yeah, and it just move like the time they have the time shifting thing going on there in the head. And you could feel how like the power of possibly nature. And of course, dolphin dance, like instantly you get these images of, like, at least for myself, just beautiful dolphin, like we live by
Yeah.
the ocean,
What would
you
it
know how
be?
cool.
A school of dolphins, is it?
Yeah, I mean, and you've seen it because we live by the shore. It's like one of the greatest things in the world to see and to witness, right? Um, so it does work for that reason. But just to kind of backtrack a little bit, so that connectivity, the centralized concept, and I think a great jazz album, small group jazz album, has to. I don't know if it has to, but typically the ones that I think are great have a certain degree of experimentation that's outside of what's been done before. That's a little bit outside of the norm.
Well, maybe yes, maybe no. Do you find experimentation on, say, any of Dexter Gordon's records?
In a way, I guess I do. Um, I'm not saying they're not great songs on Dexter Gordon's records, but I never think of his records, and I could be wrong, maybe Go. Um, and I love Dexter Gordon,
Right.
but I don't really think of his albums as much of a concept as much as, like, when I listen to Dexter Gordon, I'm okay with taking an individual track sometimes and just listening to that track. Whereas when I listen to this record, I really like to hear it as a record. But that's me.
I got you. Okay. Yeah, you don't really find a um, that much of a concept or a unified whole. The
Yeah,
group sort of like a record like Go, the group makes it unified, but that's it.
yeah. And I'll be honest, I really don't like specifically love records a lot of times as a record when there's a lot of guest artists or when the personnel changes within the record. I like to hear the conversation between
Right.
the stream throughout, you know. I appreciate the music, don't get me wrong. Beautiful, great music can come of that. But when you have a working group like these guys will, you know, like at least the rhythm section was a working unit.
Right.
I think it really enhances like there's something about that.
Yeah, the whole thing is a great conversation. So here's to sort of go back to your first question. Here's what I think makes this record a classic. What makes it special? So you have really memorable compositions. Um, even the framework, the sort of framework for free improvisation. Um, Man, the title is eluding me now. But the fourth track, the track before Dolphin Dance.
Oh, is it not little one? Survival of the fittest, is it?
Survival of the Fittest,
Yeah.
right? That's a really good composition. Um, and it's a framework for sort of free improvisation, but there's nothing random about it. So what you have are five memorable compositions. They each have different moods, and Hancock is also utilizing. It's only a quintet, but he's utilizing a lot of different colors and a lot of different moods with the quintet.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe that sort of separates it from a lot of quintet jazz. You know, there's just a little bit more variety that Hancock has in his compositions, and also coaxes out of the sidemen on the record.
Yeah, I agree. And also, you don't have, well, there are standards now, but there was no, they're all written by Hancock. There was no standards on this record. I think that's adds to it as well.
Oh yeah, a standard would not make sense on this record.
Maybe Wave.
You know what, that wave is probably like one of the most overplayed tunes ever. But I have a feeling that if Hancock had put decided to put it on the album, they would have come up with something fresh on it.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah.
So
Yeah. So I mean, okay. So we have these five very individualistic players, four of which you kind of stated, we're doing things that we're moving the idiom forward. Coleman, a masterful player who was, exploratory, but maybe not in that same realm, perhaps.
Right.
And working really well together. We have this overall kind of concept with the five Herbie tunes, all dealing with nautical life, as you put it.
Yeah, I see it as a really free and artistic impression of the sea by Hancock and his sidemen. So it's not like programmatic movie music. It's abstract.
Right. Yeah. and
Um,
he sort of avoided the blue note. I don't want to call it the blue note trappings at the time, but you know, they were really trying to perpetuate this groove based music and to find a boogaloo type thing to sell.
well, yes, of course, yeah. But the interesting thing is, so you're leading the title track. You're leading off. It's not a boogaloo, but it's definitely it's got a groove. It's sort of a groove tune in its own way. It's not
Yeah,
it's not going to cross over to jukeboxes like the Sidewinder did,
right.
or Watermelon Man, but yet there's a groove in there people can relate to, you know. But one interesting thing is the tune is based on this groove, but and in lesser hands. I mean, like for example, my first year I was in college, our instructor had us do Maiden Voyage as a tune, and so you had like 5 minutes of ding 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 go ding ding, but which can get sort of boring, right? We just but listen to what Hancock and the rhythm section are doing. You could feel that groove, but they're moving slightly away. One might be moving slightly away while the other two are holding it.
Hmm.
They're taking liberties and being really really creative with it.
Right.
Uh, but you could still feel the groove. You could still feel that groove.
Yeah, yeah, you can, and I'm sure you've played both that song and Dolphin Dance numerous times,
Oh yeah.
as have I. And you know, I almost cringe sometimes when those songs are called, and the reason being is I've had some really good moments playing those songs. Not necessarily me personally, but I have played them and I felt like it was successful. But more often than not, I feel like kind of meanders when in the wrong hands, you know?
Yeah, yeah, and also with dolphin dance, maybe not to get too technical. You could stop me at any point.
Oh no, this is fun.
But I think Herbie Hancock was a little bit vague about what some of the chords were
Yeah,
in
yeah,
certain sections too. So there's conflicting, and they make it work, you know. But in lesser hands, it could just sound like um, uh, people are people are playing conflicting stuff.
yeah. It's true, and I think I'm not sure. Is it? I'm pretty sure it's Dolphin. One of those two, I forget.
Yeah,
But the way it's written in the real book, which is for those of you who are not familiar, it's like the jazz study guide or the jazz Bible, and some people really lean on it as being gospel when it's really there's a lot of mistakes in there.
right.
Uh, I think there's like 4 bars missing in one of those tunes in the real book, or it's written. One of the versions has it written wrong. So
Hmm.
inevitably, people get turned around when they try to play this song, you know.
I yeah, it, it it it's not an easy tune.
But on paper, it doesn't look difficult. Neither one of those,
Hmm.
which is why it's hard. Because it has that amount, because it has that looseness and that space, right? And
Right.
what to do with that space, and it's not at a rapid tempo. So your statements, you really have to make some pretty cohesive statements to make that song work, you know. As a
And that's the thing about this record too. It's, everything is cohesive, but it's not planned. It's just spontaneous cohesion.
Mhm.
They're not playing it safe there at all. They're being creative throughout the record, but nothing feels forced to me on this record.
I agree.
It's just so natural and musical. And there's a lot of that. It can be very bold, but it's not bold. It's not bold as an effect. It's just it. The bold sections grow out of what's happening.
Yeah, I agree. And then, I mean, a lot of that boldness, well, Tony Williams, particularly on that one track, Survival of the Fittest, we were talking about, but um, even when like Freddie builds a solo, and George Coleman to the same extent, I think, or maybe a little lesser extent, but in a similar way, he often builds his solo so remarkably, and then within somewhere in the middle of his improvisation, he'll do something that's completely musically surprising, or like
Yeah,
overblow, or like just change the vibe in the same way that I guess the tides can change, or you know,
yeah.
or a fish can change its direction.
You hear all that right in the title track. They
Right.
both uh, Coleman and Freddie Hubbard both start their solos pretty reflectively. Very in Hubbard's case, more reflectively than you often hear him playing in this period. You
Yeah.
know, he's definitely inspired by Hancock's compositions to play a little bit differently than he would normally play. But then they start reflectively, and then they build, and and then you hear them explode in a way, and then they come back down, and then they build it back up.
Yeah. Yeah, it's like a story. Each improvisation, I mean, there's not one dud, and like each improvisation is its own story within itself.
Yeah, and even in the Survival of the Fittest tune, which is it doesn't sound to me like Hancock planned what they would improvise over. They're still playing like super coherently and musically.
Yeah, yeah. And then as I listen to that track more and more, I mean, Tony, it seems like the first time I heard it, it's like all of a sudden Tony Williams just takes a solo, right? And then in between the improvs of the other musicians, and then he does it again. But I realized like it's an interlude. Like
Yeah, that
it,
might be that could be planned. Yeah.
yeah, it was planned, but it's like I don't even know if it's just, I'd have to listen again to see even if it's the same amount of bars. It is. I almost feel like it's
Oh,
a.
I don't think so.
I don't think.
I,
Right?
I think it's he plays, and then when the next soloist feels it's right, he comes in.
Yeah.
I
I mean,
could be totally wrong. I haven't analyzed it, but that way. But
yeah, and if that's true, I mean that goes back to this connectivity. Like, hey, when do I come? Like, how do they know just to enter that spot, right? Um, because they're
yeah,
masters.
exactly. And Coleman too. He's a master. He may not be the innovator that the other four are, but he's a master nevertheless.
He
He's
is. He is, and I don't want people to think that that we're lessening him in any way, because he's certainly one of those great technicians, and a very
well more
creative.
than that, really musical too.
Right, and a guy who's still around and still making music.
Yeah,
In fact, I interviewed his son for one of the podcasts, and
I heard that. I enjoyed it.
in doing this research, I just decided. Did you know he acted in some films as well?
George Coleman.
George Coleman Sr. was in the
Wow. No,
yeah,
I didn't know that.
it's a good. So he was in the movie Free Jack, which was Mick Jagger's. Mick Jagger produced the movie, if I'm not mistaken. I think he might even be, or he's in it, and it was like a successful movie. And then The Preacher's Wife with God, I want to say Whitney Houston, perhaps, but another like major film. I think he had a very small role, but
Right.
to think, I never thought of it's just funny how the things you learn when you research these things.
Dexter Gordon and George Coleman actors.
Yeah.
Tenor saxophonist slash actors.
Yeah, well, I thought Dexter was quite good in his role, to be quite honest.
He had one after that too, right? Wasn't there after around midnight?
I don't know. I don't know.
Now
I
I'm
never.
really getting sidetracked, but I think he did have one after that.
Right, and Miles acted as well. He was in a good amount of stuff. Miles was.
I haven't seen it, but I'll have to seek it out.
Oh, Miles was he was in oh shit. What's that 80s show with Don Johnson? Miami Vice.
Miami Vice.
If I'm
Yeah.
not mistaken, I think he had a recurring role in Miami Vice. Yeah,
Wow,
which yeah, it's good.
that's wild.
All right, Mike. So what else could you say? Anything I missed regarding
Let's see.
this record?
You want me to zip down my notes on this one?
Of course, yeah. Tell me what you think. I don't
Okay.
think like you didn't talk.
So we sort of talked about the nautical theme, so we'll scratch that. So I put while the compositions each can suggest a certain mood and possibly theme, there is much variety within each tune. The players all lend their own individual personalities and styles to interpret and shape the compositions. And the way they have the album the album was put together, it's perfectly balanced and put together. It's just right. It's not too much and it's not too little. So maybe they shouldn't have. I would lobby against throwing on "Wave" at the end of the album.
Of course, of course. No, I think you know what? That's also a good point that you made. I think you alluded it to. It's, the programming of it, the way they put the tracks, the order in which they put the tracks.
Yeah,
I don't think it would work anywhere near as well if they changed it. That might have been a producer thing. I'm not sure, but right. It seems like 5 tracks is the perfect amount. I think each track, ranges somewhere between maybe 6 minutes and 12 minutes, or maybe, in that range.
yeah,
Enough room to make the statement, but it's not so long that you kind of would lose the casual jazz fans uh interest,
yeah. I mean, even the length of the solos. I'm not sure. If Hancock said play 2 choruses on Dolphin Dance, but whatever it is, the players make their statement. There's a lot of variety within each solo,
Mhm.
and it's the perfect length. The solos are perfect length for me, anyway.
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, I think every song is exactly, it's like if each song was a meal, they made it the perfect meal. You know what I mean? Like
Exactly.
the appetizers there, the entree, the dessert. That's it. No need for any other conversation.
I
We
I I would be interested to hear alternates, but I wouldn't want them on the record.
right. Right. Yeah. I'm always funny about it's crazy with alternate tracks. I'm always funny about it because I'm like, somewhere there was a choice being made. Now maybe it wasn't the musician's choice, and there's some great alternate tracks of everything. And of course, like if you're somebody who's a devotee of, like, say, John Coltrane, like I want to hear everything he played.
Mhm.
Like I don't care if it's good, I don't care if it's bad. As if he put that saxophone to his mouth, I want to have heard it. You know what I mean?
Right.
But I think in terms of an album, like I actually don't particularly like when they put alternate tracks on a record. I very often skip them and listen to them in a separate listening.
I'm cool as long as they put the alternates after the tracks that originally came out, because
Oh,
then I like to hear them. But if I want to hear the record the way it was intended and was put together, then I can listen to the 5 tracks or whatever and
mhm.
skip the alternates. What I don't like is having a track, its alternate, the second alternate, and then go on to the next track. I think
Yeah,
that's awful programming.
yeah. I think what comes to mind is maybe Bill Evans' "Sunday at the Village Vanguard." I think they do that, or at least on some versions of it.
Yeah.
And yeah, it bothers me. And I love that group, man. I mean, it's like one of my favorite groups. But I do want to hear it because I love that group, but in a different format, perhaps.
So another if I could be permitted to run off at the mouth, here's a few more uh, impressions of it. Portions of the album reflect and incorporate cutting edge devices of the time period, such as modality and as we discussed, free improvisation. However, they're filtered in a natural, individual way through both Hancock's compositions and the improvisation and group interplay of the quintet. And I feel like, as we discussed, they're improvisers of the highest order working together to interpret superior compositions in a very organic and creative way.
Yes, I'm giving
Yeah.
you the floor, but I think everything you said was.
Now, those statements might have sounded forced, but nevertheless,
Oh no, I mean, I appreciate that you took the time to, to even, you know, gather such thoughts. It's great.
and Hancock's um, superior mastery of harmony really comes through on here too.
Yes, and everything you say actually, like in my, as the listeners listen to my track by track analysis, I think everything you're mentioning is referenced in some way. I mean, I'm in total agreement with everything that you're saying.
So, and any other questions?
No other questions, perhaps. I mean, in terms of Herbie Hancock records, and he's had so many and he's so varied, but I mean, I think out of the first five, this is the fifth studio release, I believe, of Hancock, and I think he really, it was, it's a bit of a turning point, I think, in his development and his career. This record, and I like them all, but I think there's something about this one that was the first, like, out of his five earliest records. And I did Imperial Isles, which I think is a great record, but there's something about this one that I really think functions as a record more successfully, perhaps, than his previous four.
I'd agree with that. It's really just so well put together.
Yeah.
So,
All right. Cool, man. So maybe we have you come do another record at some point, I hope. I always enjoy talking to you about this stuff.
it's a blast. Thank you for having me,
Of course.
and I'm happy to discuss whatever record you'd like me to.
Oh, be careful with that. I'll put you on the. There's some different stuff on there. 65 was an amazing year for music. It really was a bit of a transitional year, and this has been such an eye-opening project for me. I'm listening to things in a way like this is really been an experience, and I'm hoping that at least maybe somebody hears this, and I know it happens because I talk to people. They're going to hear this record for the first time, and I think it's important that they know of this music, and that they know the name Herbie Hancock for sure, and the players who are on this album. I think all of them are really important to the trajectory of American music.
Yeah, maybe somebody that only knows Rocket or something hears this podcast and listens to Maiden Voyage.
Right, because Herbie's, I mean, talk about a varied career and the ability to shape shift as a musician and do it without even though Rocket's a little cheesy, let's be honest, but it's it was a period piece, I would say. And yeah, people might not know Herbie Hancock in this realm, so cool, Mike. I appreciate you, man, and I hope maybe I'll see you this Thursday at the jam session if you're around.
Well,
Oh,
not
you're
this
not around.
Thursday. I will be in Utah this Thursday.
Oh, right, hiking some kind of crazy structure or something, right?
Zion National Park. Looking
Oh, wow.
forward to that.
Have a great time, man.
Thank you. So I will regretfully have to decline the invitation, but I always enjoy going to the jam session.
All right, well, we'll do it in the next one.
I will be there.
All right, my friend. All right, we talked about it enough. Now let's listen. Let's drop the needle on side number one, track number one, Maiden Voyage. And of course, I just said that I'm going to talk a little bit more. So from the opening notes, you know something special is happening here. The melody is pretty simplistic and the chord changes are minimal. The blend of the tenor and the trumpet working together is always a perfect sound. I love that blend. And it's evident that the musicians have this connectivity, particularly within the rhythm section, and that could have only been developed by a unit that had worked together previously. Now, the first solo goes to George Coleman, who we talked a lot about. I believe Coleman has a beautiful tone. He presents well-connected solo phrases. He was, in fact, very well respected. And although some people do not mention him amongst the great saxophonists of his era, he should be at least in that conversation, I believe. Coleman worked as a member of Miles Davis's band from 1963 through 1964. I looked it up. And it's part of some incredible Miles records, including My Funny Valentine and Four and More, two of my personal favorites. Now, after leaving Miles' band, he was replaced by the great Wayne Shorter, who we've talked about. He went on to play with other legends, Lionel Hampton, Chet Baker, Horace Silver, Charles Mingus, Ahmad Jamal, so many others. Also presents some of his solo works, and still playing great. The next soloist is Freddie Hubbard. And he's one of the most celebrated and explosive trumpeters to emerge in the 1960s. There's just not enough adjectives to describe his creativity and his technicality. He is simply incredible. Listen to how he builds his solo here and how the ensemble follows his direction. Also take notice of the quality of his tone and the cohesiveness of his improvised statement. Again, just remarkable. And then Herbie Hancock comes in with his own solo, which is atmospheric and full of subtleties. Hancock is simply one of the most inventive pianists and musicians to have ever played in the jazz idiom. He began recording as a solo artist beginning in 1962, with his first release taking off. And as we mentioned, this is his fifth release, and many believe his best to this point. Following his solo, the Hubbard and Coleman come back in. They present the main melody, and then the piece comes to a resting point. Maiden Voyage, the song, is considered a jazz standard. It's frequently played by various jazz musicians, been recorded by many musicians of note, but this is the gold standard, the original. So enjoy Herbie Hancock's Maiden Voyage. The second track is The Eye of the Hurricane. With no intro or warning, the group comes out swinging, and the main melodic statement showcases time field changes in the same way in which perhaps a hurricane can take unexpected paths. Freddie Hubbard takes the first solo and he plays with great fire and energy, and behind it all is the power of this amazing rhythm section. The section works as a team, and although they play with a defined time, you know what's going on, the beat is there, they accent things in a unique way and sometimes break the pulse in a way that only they could. They had this very specific way of playing. Now, the second solo belongs to Coleman, who presents a series of bop and post-bop statements. Herbie Hancock follows with a mixture of bebop, post-bop, and modal type playing. At this time, Herbie was really great at taking risks in his playing without going so far out that it alienated core or casual jazz listeners. It's accessible, but still creative. And then after Herbie's solo, the melodic theme returns, and trust me, this storm is worth braving. Check it out, The Eye of the Hurricane. So as with many jazz records from the 1960s, there's not a whole lot of tracks, right? There's only 5, so it's already time to flip the record, drop the needle on side number 2. Track number 1 is called Little One. And it begins kind of nebulous, and then it settles into a groove around 1 minute and 30 seconds, where it morphs into a jazz waltz. George Coleman opens with the first solo. And as he sometimes does, he builds upon shorter phrases, leaving enough space for the listener to absorb each one of those phrases, each one of those solo statements. And then underneath it all is, of course, this tonal rhythmic palette that's created by one of the most celebrated rhythm sections in all of jazz. The next solo comes from Freddie Hubbard. Again, I'm just running out of things to say about Hubbard. He's just awesome. He never disappoints who doesn't hear. Underneath his solo, this Ron Carter, if you listen, you hear him sliding up and down the strings of the bass. It's kind of subtle, but it's effective. And then Hancock solos next. And instead of fast pianistic runs, he offers less note-heavy melodic statements and uses some gorgeous harmonic voicings, a master of harmony. Then Ron Carter gets into the mix. He plays his first and only solo on the record. It's not overly technical, but well-connected, finely handled. He's Ron Carter. He's one of the best. And then the music settles as the time breaks down, and the opening theme is again offered. Little One. Okay, side number 2, track number 2, Survival of the Fittest, which begins with a quasi-Latin groove played on the piano by Herbie Hancock, of course, followed by a bass statement before a breakdown leads to the first of several drum breaks by Tony Williams. Now, Tony Williams simply is one of the most skilled and inventive performers to have ever played the drums. And at the time of this recording, he was only, I think, 19, maybe 20, but he was really young. The music moves to a fast swing against Freddie Hubbard soloing. Now here you can really hear the rhythm section at work. Take specific notice of how Herbie, Ron, and Tony create underneath this solo by shifting accents, temporarily breaking up time, and moving in a direction together in a way that no other rhythm section seemed to be able to do at the time. And the music settles after Hubbard's solo, and Williams plays another drum break, and he centers it around the tom-toms. George Coleman then enters with his solo, and the rhythm section gets even more exploratory. Coleman plays with great fire and precision here. Herbie then begins his solo as the rhythm section lays back now. Herbie creates sort of this meditative state with this left hand repetition thing that he's doing, and he runs up and down the keyboard with the right hand against this left hand sort of ostinato or repeated figure. And he shifts in and out of ideas. I think it's my favorite solo of his on the record, and it's some of the most daring playing on the album, showcasing Herbie's interest in more free jazz forms. Once again, Tony plays another break, Tony Williams, between this solo, and here he goes into full basher mode. He could play with some great energy, great fire. I keep using that word, but it works. And then the horns return, Hubbard and Coleman, with a few well-executed little rhythmic stabs before the song ends abruptly. Enjoy. The final track on the original LP is Dolphin Dance. It's a Herbie Hancock classic. And, without the benefit of song lyrics, again, I talked about the responsibility of titling a jazz piece. And he does a perfect job here. The image of dolphins dancing works quite well with the music, which is subtle, somewhat simple, and perfectly executed, at least the main melody. And it's one of the most cover tunes of Herbie Hancock's, blending modal playing and swing music. Now, I should have mentioned what modal playing is a little earlier. In jazz, it's basically playing over less chord changes. There's not a lot of harmonic material that's presented, at least written. And then it's playing over a specific scale. So usually less chord changes, playing over very defined scales, creates a certain degree of subtlety that might not have been something that a bebop musician would have been as comfortable with. And it really works here. So the tempo is medium slow, and the melody and the music overall has this breath and this certain air that's created by the ensemble and the writings of Herbie Hancock. Freddie Hubbard takes the first improvisation, and as always, he enhances the product. I mean, he's just an artisan. And then George Coleman counters, and his phrases and statements work particularly well over the slower tempo. And the nature of the rhythm section, the exploratory nature of the rhythm section against his solo is also notable. Herbie Hancock then comes in, and there is beauty in hearing Hancock play now in a trio setting. It's just Hancock with Williams on the drums and Ron Carter on the bass. And they just worked so well together, and just hearing the three alone is a treat. The ensemble re-enters, meaning Coleman and Hubbard, to present the final melody, bringing this sea journey to a perfect close. All right, we did it. We made it through the record. We talked about it a lot. So let's lift the needle off the record and put it away for another day. This is a timeless piece of art, so you're going to want to return to it, of course. And having heard it maybe for the first time, we certainly are better for having checked out this record. So in conclusion, Maiden Voyage is a remarkable album, showcasing the personality of Hancock's writing styles and the incredible execution and creativity of the musicians on the record. It is exploratory but not overly experimental or pretentious. Therefore, if you are looking for a Herbie Hancock album to begin with, this would be a great maiden voyage into the mind and the music of one of the most impactful jazz pianists and composers, Herbie Hancock. I certainly hope you enjoyed today's podcast. I want to give thanks to Mike Kaplan for again joining me on the program. And I also want to mention in memoriam to Richard Davis, who we talked about in the Out to Lunch program. Great jazz bass player, one of my personal favorites. And I know Mike is very fond of his playing as well, as we discussed in season number 1. So rest in peace, Richard Davis, great jazz bass player. If you're listening to this in real time, I want to mention a few gigs that I have. Thursday night, 7 to 9:30, Long Branch Distillery. I'll be hosting that jam session. So come on out if you're a player or just an appreciator of live music. It's free. Come check it out. Saturday, private gig with Steve Meyerson, who was on this program, and drummer Bobby Boyd. That one's a private thing. You can't go to that. But Sunday, you can check out the Vintage Vibe Trio. I'll be playing guitar actually on this gig, 12 to 4 at Holland Farms in Creambridge, New Jersey. I think you'll really enjoy the band if you're in that area. Also, check out my book, A History of American Music, 1750 through 1950. That's available on Kendall Hunt. And I also just had an article on Third World, and you remember Cat Core, where you had him on the show. You could check that out at Jersey Jazz Magazine. That's New Jersey Jazz Magazine. So together, my friends, let's keep this music alive. I look forward to joining you again very shortly. Have a wonderful day.